And I was like, oh, I see Baltimore is representing. And so when we were thinking about this, and they were like, libraries, what libraries are you interested in? They were like, Enoch Platt. I was like, that one. Yes, we definitely want to be here. We do want to be there. So that's all background. And I want to say, thank you for all of you for coming out. It's amazing to see all of you, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, shout out to West Charlotte Library.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, I hope, since this whole room is your family and friends, everybody is buying extra copies of the book.
Right. Your holiday season is coming up, so.
Well, why don't you just tell us more about the book and the title?
So the title, Three or More is a Riot, came, sometimes you have like a title before you have the book. And, when I was in Charleston, South Carolina, covering the trial of Dylan Roof, and this was 2017. And so for some of you know, I heard the response. Some of you know who Dylan Roof is. If you don't recall, he is the white supremacist who killed 9 people in the basement of Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. And I was there covering his trial, and I was thinking about the way that moment fit into the history of South Carolina, fit into the history of the South, fit into the history of the country. And in 1739, there was an uprising in South Carolina called the Stono Rebellion. See somebody nodding, they're familiar with it. And so one of the largest colonial era revolts. And people, I always will tell this to my students as kind of a trick question. I was like, people, escaped from the farms and plantations where they're being held and fled south for freedom. And then it will like raise an eyebrow, like they fled south. What do you mean they fled south? People fled north. No, they fled south. Because you remember that Florida was still a Spanish possession at that time. And there was that long tradition of people fleeing into Seminole possessions and also Spanish possessions. They might not return you to bondage in the colonies. And so after that, there's a sharp intensification of the kind of status of slavery. And one of the things that happens is that there is the colonial legislature passes this measure which defines a slave revolt as 3 or more Negroes outside the company of a white man. And so, I would do that sometimes, like jokingly, like I remember it was one time it was me and Hilton Alls and Khalifa Sana in the offices of the New Yorker, and I was like, this is a slave revolt! I was like, I'll be in like random places where there are just three black people. I'm like, this used to be. But more seriously, that degree of paranoia, that degree of racial paranoia was integral to the trajectory of South Carolina's history. And I'm just using South Carolina as an example here. And it echoed in the writing and thinking of Dylan Roof. And then it also occurred to me that in many municipal codes, the definition of a riot is mayhem committed by 3 or more people. If it's just 2 of you, you're just acting a fool. You have to find a third if you actually want to have a proper riot. And I thought just about the resonances of that, and I was like, that phrase, 3 or more is a riot. And then I started writing all of these pieces and thinking about, in some way, the kind of through line being demography and the number of us who were present in a particular place. And we could get into a whole other kind of thing about, American demography and its relationship to the exact kind of reactionary politics that we're seeing now. But I feel like my answer to that question has already gone on too long, so.
It's a collection of essays, right?
Yeah.
And it covers a pretty interesting span of time. And I think the thing that really gets me about the book is I can see, Jelani, your thoughts, your mind, what you think about this country, I can see it change over time. tell us about the first and the last essay. You start with the Trayvon Martin essay, and we end with the Ben Crump essay. Tell us about those.
So the first thing that I ever wrote for the New Yorker involved this piece, which at the time, you know, I'd met David Remnick at a get-together that a friend of mine, kind of a dinner thing that a friend of mine had put together. And he was like, I didn't have any connection to the New Yorker at the time, and he was like, at the table, he was like, I'm gonna sit you across from David Remnick, say something smart. And I don't know if I said anything smart or whatever, but he did give me his information and said, let's keep in touch. And if you're interested in writing something for the New Yorker, let me know. And this is so weird since I'd wanted to write for the New Yorker for like all of my adult life. But I was like, this guy is not serious. And then a few days later, I heard from Amy Davidson, who was then one of the editors at the website. And she said, would you consider contributing something? And I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about, you know, this or this. And she was like, do you know, you have any interest in this, at that point, news blip in Florida, where there's a young man who has been killed and there's been no arrest and so on. And like, we didn't have any other kind of context around it. And I was like, okay, I'll take a look and I'll write something. And I wrote this piece about the relationship between Trayvon Martin and Barack Obama. And that Barack Obama was the most powerful man in the world. He was a black man. He's a black man, he's the most powerful man in the world. And in that fraction of a moment, the least powerful person in the country was Trayvon Martin, that fraction of a moment before he died. And so there was that paradox, you know, and the kinds of things that we thought were inimical to a black presidency, i.e. the murder of black boys with impunity. Like, we didn't think those two things would coexist because we didn't think we would ever have a black president. And if we ever did, it would be at a point where we were so far evolved that we wouldn't be grappling with those kinds of problems. But that moment clarified, as had some other moments prior to that we didn't pay close attention to, but that moment clarified, you know, that contradiction. And so I wrote about that. And then we went on, I just saw somebody else over there. Hey, man, all my people are here. Let's see, make sure there's nobody I owe money back then. but when we kind of go through the arc, you know, of Trayvon, and it's 2012, and the collection ends in 2024. And, you know, in there, you know, was Ferguson, there was Charleston, there was the 2016 election, there were a whole array of cultural things that were happening, you know, in between, and, you know, important stalwarts who were passing away, whose obituaries I wrote in the New Yorker. And when I looked at the collection, I was like, oh, we're seeing the landscape change through at least one limited lens, but it's the landscape change and also like how I saw things, you know, began to change along with it. And then the final piece is the piece, Profile of Ben Crump, which I wrote about, you know, what he was attempting to do. And his strategy was that if black people are killed with impunity and that the law won't actually deliver consequences, if criminal law won't deliver consequences, then maybe civil law and gigantic fines can make a statement about the value of black lives. And so the title of that piece was Black Lives Cost. So that's the bookends.
I was interested in those bookends because it seems like there's a duel between hope and cynicism.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah. Which is basically being black in America.
Right.
At this point, being American, period. Being American and cognizant, you know, I think is that duel.
Your first answer to my first question, you went back to the Stoner Rebellion. Obviously, you are a historian. I think a lot about this moment now in these past few years in relation to all these times in history that we give names to now,
Yep.
right? We got Reconstruction, we got Redemption.
Right.
For you as a historian, what would you say is the undercurrent, the main through line for this era we're in?
Mm-hmm.
What is this?
I mean, this is you know, the cycle of American history that we've been locked in, you know, since before, literally before there was in America. You know, the people who are in power now believe themselves to be redeemers. Now, you know, when we talk about the period of redemption, you know, we should take that phrase ironically, because what redemption entailed was mass murder of people to prevent black people from voting. The origin and you know, developmental structure of segregation coming into existence, you know, lynching, all these things that reduced, the objective was to reduce the newly emancipated black population back to something as close, that resembled as close to the status of slavery as possible. You know, as much as you could get to eradicate the idea that emancipation had actually occurred. And that had been the objective. But again, when I talk with my students, you know, going back to like what's really kind of driving this, when I talk with my students, you know, I'll ask, you know, why did Mississippi expend so much energy disenfranchising black people? You know, why did South Carolina expend so much energy doing? Why did Louisiana, you know, expend so much energy? And you know, they always go to like, well, racism. Racism was necessary but not sufficient. It doesn't explain the entirety of this. Racism in a lot of places, but why did these people go to such extremes to make sure that black people didn't vote? They never get it, the most obvious answer. Like, why is it that they did this? Because there were a lot of them, that's why. In Mississippi, where the black population is the majority, you can't have democracy because they will win. And the thing that you have to understand is that their allegiance was to power. It was never to democracy. It was never to the Constitution. And so if the Constitution could provide them with power, then they were in favor of it. But if the Constitution could not provide them with power, or if they would lose in a fair election, then they weren't loyal to the Constitution, as exemplified by the fact that 11 states seceded from the Union. And so Louisiana, with populations, black populations in 40-something%, now it's about a third. South Carolina, again, where the black population is the majority for a large portion of its history. And so they are trying to retain control of the demography, which is why, you know, I also point out, it is not a coincidence that, you know, we just saw this Louisiana case being argued at the Supreme Court that could potentially upend the Voting Rights Act. It is not a coincidence that these attempts to derail voting rights are happening at the same time that we see masked federal agents dragging people out of their cars, dragging them out of their homes, dragging them out of whatever institution or place that they are, that we see the crackdown on universities, which is something I have seen up close. When you look at all of these universities that have been penalized financially, one of the things that happened, that has come up in these conversations, is that the federal government would say, oh, we could go a little easier on you if you reduce the number of international students that you admit. Why is that? Because very often admission to an American university is the first step for a person in gaining citizenship in the United States. There is that. And so if you can curtail the number of people who are coming in internationally and reduce the access that black people have to the ballot box, you can curate the electorate in such a way that you still retain power. And that's what ties all of this together.
It's always,
I'm never fun.
Yeah, no, we're having fun, but like,
I know, people are like, God, dog, I felt good till I came in and started talking to you.
At the same time, though, right? You've got your book, you've got your work, you've got more access to history that actually tells the real story now than ever before.
Right. That's the point of it.
That's the point of it.
Yep. So let me say this, right? I'm an acolyte of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And so, and I mean that literally. Like, I was mentored by people who were part of the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History. Yeah, that's right. Like, people know, right? When I was an undergrad at Howard, those people, like, oh, wait, we got Howard people up in here? It says HU, I'll say you know. And so I'm just like full of friends and family. Might as well like barbecue out here.
To get up. Y'all hit me for the repast.
I know, right? Exactly. right. And so I don't even remember where. So Dr. Woodson, the thing that is like crucial to understand about him, he founded what was then the Association to Study of Negro Life and History, later changed to African American. But Dr. Woodson was literally risking his life by writing the books that he wrote. He was born in 1875, did not start high school till age 21, worked in a coal mine, went to Berea College, then went to Harvard University, became the second black person to earn a PhD from Harvard University. First person was W.E.B. Du Bois. Also point out, not a coincidence that the first two black people to get PhDs from Harvard got them in history, because they understood that history was the battleground that you had to clear in order to even get to the present. And so he and Du Bois both wrote these books trying to create a foundation for subsequent struggle. It's like you go in the kitchen, you were about to cook, but you're like, I cannot cook until I clean this kitchen. It was like, okay, we had to clean the kitchen in order to get to the point where we could even start the other task that comes after that. And so that was the point. And for those generations of historians who were, the generations of historians who were committed to democracy, who have continued the work that they did, it was precisely for this moment, so that people would have a contemporary struggle and they wouldn't have to go clear the dishes. It's like, okay, we can start where we are, and we can actually look back. We can actually use this history strategically to try to understand what they were trying to tell us. They were trying to give us the best, they were trying to equip us as the best way that they could to grapple with a moment precisely like this one.
The paradox, though, is that the access to that history is one of the animating factors for this moment. So the thing people are targeting is black history.
That's right.
If you go to schools, when I was a kid, I'm from North Carolina. I don't know how folks did it up here, but we learned that the Civil War was a war of northern aggression.
That's right, yeah.
And they're going back to that. I'm not that old. They're
Right.
going back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But never really went away. Right, never really went away. We always say that the South lost the war but won the historiography. That was the initial version of it, So they have had this kind of contention that's been simmering for a long time and waiting for the opportunity to begin to advance that argument. But the difficulty is, in a lot of ways, that the cat is out of the bag. Like, this is not, they don't have the kind of hegemony that they had, when W.E.B. Du Bois wrote like what people consider his greatest book, Black Reconstruction, he used secondary sources by and large. And people would use that to kind of diminish the work. And like, oh, well, it's not important. He didn't use primary sources as much. He used secondary sources. But one of the other things was like, picture him going to the archives in South Carolina in 1930, talking about, yes, I would like access to your files about how the state treated Negroes between 1865 and 1875. Yeah, that wasn't happening. And so they produced that work under those circumstances. We've produced all these volumes of work subsequently that have built upon it, and then we have access to means and mechanisms of disseminating this. So it was no longer a kind of uncontended story. Like, we have a battle of knowledge and a battle of facts and a battle of, we're having this conversation here. And so it's a kind of continuum, I think, and that's like the important thing. It's also by the way, if I'm tying this into like what I do at the journalism school, I teach a course called American History for Reporting. And it's precisely because when our students go out, I don't want them to report on what's happening in Louisiana like it's a new thing. I was like, the fact that it's news doesn't mean it's new. You know, sometimes it's a new iteration of an older problem. And so we have to be able to contextualize the things that come before it. And, you know, maybe they ban a book. You know, maybe they have libraries that are forced to purge things from their shelves. Well, now we have digital ways to send out stuff. Or what Ava DuVernay did with, you know, her distribution network Array, where she made all of her films available to people, even, you know, if you don't have access to them in the library, you can like find access to them in other ways. And so that's exactly like what this kind of battle looks like. It's a battle of footnotes with democracy in the balance.
As a historian who is practicing and leading light in journalism, you chose the two least interesting fields to be involved in.
Seems like nothing happens.
Nothing happens.
Right.
Well, but, you know, with journalism, a lot's happening.
Yeah.
And a lot of not great things are happening. What, you know, we're losing newsrooms. We got newsrooms that are losing their perspective.
Yeah.
Um,
that was very
Yeah.
delicately phrased. I appreciate that.
What is it about this moment that is seems to be, I think, imperiling that field as well?
I mean, we could talk about that for the rest of the evening.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I
15
mean,
minutes.
I think it's right. It's like a perfect storm, though. It's like there's a kind of, you know, chicken and egg dynamic where we've seen this democratic backsliding, you know, which is, I know, a term that my boy Lester hipped me to, but we've seen this democratic backsliding, and we've also seen this collapse of journalism in the business model that journalism operates under. We know for a fact that when newspapers disappear, not shockingly, you know, things like corruption begin to increase. And you have city councils that become wasteful. They know that nobody is looking to see, you know, how they're spending money. I think it's possible for people to become, especially when local publications go away, it's possible for you to get much more polarized politics. And there are fewer people literally to call you on your foolishness. And so there's this kind of mutually reinforcing relationship between the dynamics that we've seen undermining journalism and the dynamics that we've seen undermining, you know, the bigger democracy that journalism is supposed to serve. And so, you know, we're trying everything that we can at the journalism school, from mechanisms for supporting local news to mechanisms for supporting students to help make it more affordable for them to even go into this profession, more affordable for them to go to the journalism school. You know, for us trying to grapple with how we use AI in ways that are advantageous to us. You know, if we have fewer people in a newsroom, how can we use it as a multiplier? There are going to be other things that AI does that are definitely detrimental to journalism, but we're hoping that we can find the balances where we can use it in ways that are useful. And so every morning, you know, basically I wake up and think about those small concerns, you know, small
concerns.
things.
Well, you know, I think one thing I keep coming back to with this moment, with this atomization of media, losing outlets, is, you know, the fact that for a long period in this country's history, the main news you got about what was happening in the South was false.
Yes.
And it was up to folks in the black press. It was up to
Right.
independent
Right.
folks to get the word out. And it seems to me like we're entering a similar time.
Yeah, we are, except that there are some dynamics that are different. So, you know, in the collapse of the major kind of establishment news organizations or the collapse of a lot of the publications that have been around institutional press. We've seen nonprofit news organizations emerge, which is like huge, and at the journalism school, we're betting big on that as one of the future models, for journalism. But we also see people who are kind of one-man, one-woman shows. And people are doing stuff on Substack, they're doing stuff in all kinds of other ways. That's great. It's really good, except that institutions do have some benefits, one of which is legal representation. Because we're seeing nuisance lawsuits pop up. I mean, we saw, was it 15 billion that just, for the New York Times, and sued the Wall Street Journal, sued CBS, sued everybody. Basically, all these news organizations are being sued. And the objective is not necessarily to win. It's to make you expend the resources that it requires to defend yourself, knowing that these budgets are strapped. And so if you can do that enough, you can drive people to maybe shade the coverage so it's a little bit more favorable to you, or to be afraid to publish a story that's going to be controversial. Now, consider what that does to an individual, a person who's just kind of hanging their shingle out. And so what we have to do, what we have yet to do, is to construct some sort of collectives, whether this is a guild or this is some sort of collective organization where people pay dues for kind of mutual coverage on issues that are related to press freedom or related to your coverage, because it really is an extreme. There are possibilities that you get that come with that, and there are also potential liabilities that come with it too. And especially in this landscape, we have to figure out how to navigate that.
Well, I hope you figure it out. Thank you.
Yeah, in the next 10 minutes, we'll sort it out.
Keep me in a job, please.
Right.
When the first answer, the title for the book, you went back to your time in Charleston. Mm-hmm. And I gather that is a formative event for you and for this book, mm-hmm. was your reporting you've been doing in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And there's a moment in the book where you say, in many ways, I'm paraphrasing, we live in Dylan Roof's America.
Yeah, we do. Mm. So here's the thing, and there's some contextual points about this that are important to consider. Dylan Roof killed 9 people in the basement of the church on June 16th, 2015. On June 15th, 2015, Donald Trump declared his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I'm not making any relationship between those things. They're not related. But there are similar elements of the zeitgeist, because in that first speech in Trump Tower, Trump says that he is running for president because the country is beset by Mexican rapists, which is what he says. In the midst of his shooting spree, Dylan Roof shoots a young man, 26 years old, by the name of Tywanza Sanders. Tywanza was gravely injured, but he wasn't dead. And he said, you don't have to do this. We mean you no harm. And in response, Dylan Roof said, you all are raping our women and taking over the world. And he shot him several times more. He died. We know this because Tywanza Sanders' mother, Felicia Sanders, was present when this happened. She did not rush to the aid of her son because she was laying on top of her 12-year-old granddaughter. And she had covered them and covered her granddaughter and herself in blood to trick Dylan Roof into thinking he had already killed them. That is how they survived. But she said in the course of the testimony in the trial, I watched my son take his first breath in this life, and I watched my son take his last breath in this life. that was her version of this. We had this language of defending people from dark rapists deployed twice in 24 hours in these different contexts, but responding to the same dynamic, which is this impression that black people had assumed a position that was not fit for them in American society, that they had outgrown. He said, and Ruth said this, he said he committed those homicides, in order to wake white people up and to tell them that they had let black people get out of hand. And when we look at the consequent decade, we see this type of violence becoming more pronounced. We see instances in Buffalo, we see instances in Pittsburgh, where the synagogue is, the Tree of Life synagogue is attacked by a white nationalist who attacks the synagogue because he believes that Jews are doing too much to help bring more people of color into the country. We see this in El Paso, the same sort of replacement theory idea that has proliferated. And we now are at a point where we are purging people of color from the United States, but allowing white Afrikaners from South Africa to enter as refugees.
Yeah, I thought about that a lot, because one of the things that popped up over and over again for Dylan Roof was the Rhodesian flag.
That's right. That's
So
right.
the Rhodesian army was his thing. And
That's
then
right.
you think about how
Ian Smith, yeah.
extreme that seemed in the discourse then. There are people like Nick Fuentes who are outside of that
That's right.
right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I'll say about this, right, which is that, and I talk about this in the piece, in the book, where two things happened that have stayed with me ever since. One was that I went to the South Carolina Museum, the Charleston Museum of the Confederacy, during the trial. This is while the trial, Ruth's trial is going on. And
They let you in?
yeah, not only did they let me in, they were like incredibly welcoming and, you know, hospitable. I mean, it's just like South Carolina, Charleston, you know, how people are. As long as you are with a certain kind of interaction, you know, it's fine. And it was fine for a little while. So there are two women there who were docents, and I'd forgotten to take off my press badge. And so eventually one of them noticed, and she said, says, press, what are you here for? And I said, I'm here to cover Dylan Roof's trial. And this was an older woman, and she said, oh, we don't need a trial. And I said, what do you mean? She said, just get rid of him. And I said, well, it's interesting you'd say that because they're deliberating about giving him the death penalty right now. And she said, no need to deliberate, just get rid of him. And so I ask what is the obvious question. What do you make of the idea that Dylan Roof did what he did as a tribute to the same cause that's being memorialized in this museum? Everything stopped. It was like, I believe this boy done got out of pocket. So, like literally, like 3 people came over to me and said, the Confederacy had nothing to do with what he did. The Confederacy was not about hate. The Confederacy was not blah, 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 blah. Right, and so I said, you know, and as a journalist, I try to like respect where people are coming from, right? Like there's the Jelani reaction, then there's the professional. I need to ask questions to get to like how people understand the world. And so I said, okay, then why do you think he flew the Confederate flag? He said he didn't understand what it meant. And I said, well, why do you think that white supremacist organizations around the world fly the Confederate flag? Because they probably just saw it on the internet. They don't know what it stands for. And this is like multiple people. This is like a group of people. And what occurred to me was that Dylan Roof was evil, but he was not a liar. And he was like, perhaps in Charleston, this place that has built an entire tourism industry on this romantic rendition of the Confederacy that necessarily has to airbrush what actually happened. There was this lie that everyone had agreed upon, everyone except Dylan Roof. And their unwillingness to confront it was exactly the thing that he was fighting against in the most profane way possible.
So you woke them up.
Oh, no. You know, I'll go through like a whole bunch of historical stuff about what it is. Then I pointed, this is the conversation goes on. I pointed to, it was like I had aides that were right there near me, like teaching aides. They had the Declaration of South Carolina's secession, which it's in there, right?
Yes,
if you read the South Carolina's Declaration of Secession, they say that they are seceding because they want to protect slavery. Like this entire conversation about states' rights is, I was like, no, literally it's in the document right there.
They said in case,
right, that's what they said.
You didn't know.
Yeah, they weren't being coy. And at some point, I'm like, okay, this conversation is done, like what is done, and I left. But that was the first thing. The second thing, I'll try to like tell this like succinctly, is that when the trial ended, I left. I had a meeting in San Francisco that I thought I was going to have to cancel because the trial was going on and on. But then the verdict came in. The death penalty rendering came in really quickly, and I actually was like, if I do my flights, I can still make this meeting. Fly to New York. I wake up first thing in the morning. I'm on a 6 a.m. flight. I fly to New York, land in LaGuardia, go to JFK. Then like I'm in JFK for a few hours, get on a flight to San Francisco, fly across the country, land in San Francisco, take a taxi from the airport to my hotel, and realize that I had not said a word to a single word to another human being the entire day. I had just been stewing in the complication, the complexity of what I had been witnessing. The last person I had spoken to was a man by the name of Malcolm Graham, whose sister, Cynthia Graham Hurd, had been killed in the church. And the last thing that he said to me was, I'm going to spend the rest of my life telling everyone who my sister was. Says this in Charleston, South Carolina. We happen to be half-mile from the Atlantic Ocean. I land in San Francisco. I am blocks from the Pacific Ocean. I have not spoken to anyone. Just to strike up conversation, I see the bellman at the hotel, and I said, how are you doing? And he was like, hey, where are you coming in from? And I said, Charleston. And he said, oh, get out of here, I'm from Charleston. And I said, he said, what brought you to Charleston? And I said, I was covering the trial of Dylann Roof. He stopped in his tracks. He said, that man took someone very important away from me. And I said, who? He said, my childhood librarian, her name was Cynthia Graham Hurd. And I was like, I honestly wondered if I had hallucinated this. And so I was like, give me your information. Do you mind if I write about this? Do you mind if I include this in the story? So on. New Yorker has a rigorous fact-checking process. No one will believe this. And so he gives me his information, we talk, whatever, and so on. I go to the hotel room. The first person I call is Malcolm Graham. And I'm like, Malcolm, you don't understand what just happened. Malcolm calmly said, I'm not surprised at all. That's who my sister was. And I was like, meanwhile, I'm like all in this story. Like you're supposed to be outside of this story. I am in this story now. And it gave me the point that I had started the morning right next to the Atlantic, and I had ended the day right next to the Pacific, and the two people who I talked to were directly affected by what happened. And so the problem we're dealing with conforms to the contours of the country itself.
Well, I've got plenty more questions, but I do want to let your friends and family section get some in. And so we have 2 microphones, one over there. And for the folks online, if you type your question in the chat box, we will receive it. So.
That is exactly right. So I'm going to hand it off to our first question, which is right behind me.
Hello, Dean Cobb.
How are you?
I'm well.
Dean Jones, how are you?
I'm well. What do you tell students, you know, in a program where some of them may have some journalism background, some of them don't, how to cover this? Because this is a generation that has grown up without the in-your-face kind of stuff that many of us lived with. So how do they cover it? How do they think? How do you move them to consider what they're doing and to begin to draw the connections between the history and what they're seeing in front of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, of course, this is Dean Jackie Jones of Morgan State, and so I'm like very fortunate that we have people who we're collaborating with and that we are able to work together, and students from Morgan State come up and visit at the journalism school and so on. My nephew is an alum of your program, and so, you know, we have all these connections. But, you know, I think that, you know, part of it is that we have to have kind of a grounding in this, and we have to kind of walk people through, like, the work. And if some people will say, what's the point of going to journalism school? There used to be this kind of way where people just matriculated through, where somebody took you under their wing, and, you know, there was the kind of stereotypical, grizzled old managing editor who had been there for 50 years and knew the mayor, could call the mayor by his first name or whatever. That person doesn't exist. And that newsroom doesn't exist. And if it does, it is in a very attenuated form. And so the kind of training where you get to figure out how to connect the dots, and how you figure out how to add the context. The same thing we was just talking about, you know, the course that I teach, you know, American History for Reporting. The people who can send you out to cover a story and then send you back because you didn't quite get it, and send you back again because you didn't quite get it. The experience that we've all had until you get the story, you know, right, and say, okay, it's actually good, and you can go with it. You know, that's what we're trying to do in those classrooms. And so literally the way that I learned was that I had a clipping file as a young person, and every time I read a good piece of journalism, I cut it out. This I was just dating myself, because I physically cut it, not like on the screen, but I physically cut it and put it in a folder, in a box. And I would go back to these stories again and again and again and again. Like, where did this quote, why did the person put this quote in this paragraph? Why is this like this? And so we walk people through those stories in the work that we do in our programs, in the hope of actually getting to this place, because it is such a steep learning curve. Like, we're putting people out, and like we've talked about, you know, we started in 1739 in this conversation, and we're still kind of walking through, you know, the implications of things that happened centuries ago. We're throwing people out, you know, into reporting with all of these things happening in all of these different kinds of areas. That's what we have to do. And so I'm glad to be in the trenches with you. We have to be in trenches. I'm glad we're in trenches together.
Oh man, you know, my first time writing for the New Yorker, I cut out on Google Docs, not in real life, your story.
Thank you, sir. I feel very old.
But yeah, that's how I learned how to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But also it's like, that's like, you know, what we're supposed to do. And also this tradition that we have. I'll say one last thing, and I know we have like questions. Proudest thing that I did, and I believe we had some of the people from Morgan came up for this, was that we have a statue of Joseph Pulitzer. He's the founder of Columbia Journalism School. We have a statue of him in the lobby of Pulitzer Hall. And, you know, year before last, we commissioned and unveiled a statue, a bust of Ida B. Wells. And so, like, this canon of journalism includes her. And that's kind of the tradition that we're working in. I'm gonna give short answers from now on, I promise.
Funny enough, I also am a Morgan alum and a Morgan broadcast alum, broadcast journalism alum. So shout out Morgan. One of the one of the things that is so interesting about this conversation and the things that you're talking about is like grounding everything in a sense of history and a sense of reality. But we also are living in a state of unreality right now, where there's a lot of not even just like propaganda, but then you also have artificial intelligence. You also have just a lot of things, including social media, that are intentionally trying to distract people, intentionally trying to misinform people, intentionally trying to steer the conversation away from history, away from facts, away from a lot of the things that we can agree on. And there's also, scarily enough, a lot of people who want that, who are kind of leaning into that, in the sense of like, if this is affirming my reality or affirming the things that I want to know, I'm okay with that. Even if I know it's not true, I've bought so far into the lie that to come out now would be to basically like become a different person. Like they're so into that. So what do you think the roles of journalism are going to be in the future, now that we're dealing with a lot of that misinformation, not only in the sense of keeping people informed, but making sure that there's still a reality for us to exist in the sense of like, when we're having conversations with people and you're bringing in, like, you were saying in that museum in South Carolina, you're pointing to the actual document that exists, that says the thing, and they're saying, I still don't, I'm not gonna buy into that. How do you as a journalist, and how do we continue to try to communicate to people the reality that we all know is true, even though a lot of people have just found themselves entrenched in this belief that like, this is what I want and I don't care what happened?
So about, I guess it was about 10 days, maybe 2 weeks ago, I was in the UK for a journalism conference, and I took the opportunity to meet up with one of my colleagues who lives in London, and she told me this fascinating story. She said that her brother came to her because he was really worried that she had been kind of seduced by misinformation and disinformation, and that she was, had kind of imbibed these ideas that weren't true, and she was being misled, and he wanted to, as her brother, just kind of like help her. Now, that conversation then goes from there to like, you have to understand that the vaccines are killing people. This is what he wants his sister to believe. It was like, it's the opposite. So the person who has fully imbibed misinformation is her brother, and he's coming to her to say that you need to believe the things that I believe. So the things that this sense of reality is under dispute. And so she's like, I don't understand, because my conversation would be with him to try to tell him he's listening to these websites and to these podcasts full of people who are uncredentialed, who don't know what they're talking about, and so on. But he thinks that the fact that they are not credentialed is the exact reason why they should be believed. And so it was a kind of rejection of the entire establishment. Nicole Hannah-Jones has a really good vantage point on this. She said that she does her work simply to create a record. And we can't make someone absorb this. We can't make someone take this for what it is. But I have to give a record that is vetted, that is fact-checked, that can be verified, so that people can say, they can't say we didn't know. And that's like the humblest aspiration. And so we start there. The other thing is that, I've personally advocated for this idea of getting rid of the concept of trust. It's like, don't trust us. I always say it's about journalists too, which is like, we lament the fact that people don't trust us anymore, but journalists are the least trusting people in the world. We don't trust anybody. Like, we can't, as a professional virtue. Like, if you go around being a trusting journalist, you're probably not a good journalist. We should encourage people to look at us the way we look at the world. Don't believe us.
They should also look at the YouTubers that same way.
Exactly. Don't believe anybody. And then, well, if you don't believe anybody, then what's the distinction? The distinction is you have to show your work. The same way as your math teacher said in 8th grade. You have to show your work. I can show you where this story came from. I can walk you through, I'll give you sources, I'll put up the raw interview files, I will give you the Freedom of Information Act thing that I filed, all these other things. The dude on YouTube can't do that because his ideas are proctological.
All right, that's it. Let's go home.
But he can't. You have to have facts, and like that becomes the ground that we compete on.
We have time for 2 more questions, and we're going to take the one behind me and then the one on the other side of the room, and then we'll go on to signing.
Proctological. Can we use that as a noun and a verb, or no, a verb, an adjective? I'm trying to run through how we can use that. So,
A modifier, right?
Hi, Mr. Cobb. I think I have a related question. For those of us who are parents, or who, in my case, are the coolest aunts alive, how can we encourage safe and accurate kind of media consumption habits among young people? How can we build that from a young age? Because when I was young, God, I sound like Clint Eastwood, get off my lawn. But we had, encyclopedias, and there was just, obviously, it just was a different world. And I am struggling as I talk to the young people in my life as they grow. And just honestly, part of it is because I don't understand the landscape quite in the same way that they do. But how can we as adults who, maybe don't understand the landscape quite in the same way that they do, how can we encourage safe and responsible media consumption habits for the young people in our lives?
Can we get the other question too, so we can just kind of do them back to back?
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a height-related issue. At work the other day, some of my colleagues were talking about the No Kings protest and the lack of people without gray hair in them. And just, I'm curious, so, and I'm sorry I wrote this down, but so we still reference like the March in Washington from 60 years ago, and it seems like we've already forgotten about No Kings, and that was like 2 weeks ago. So the second part of this, the real part of this question is like, given how policing and surveillance have evolved, but tactics have largely stayed the same, what do you think civil disobedience needs to look like to move society forward? Or has that form of activism just seen its time in the sun and now it's just not?
Yeah, that's an easy question. Not really. So on the kind of media literacy side of this, I think that one of the interesting things is that I have been, in my capacity as a dean, able to kind of see what people are doing in different places. I was in Jordan, actually, and there are kind of media literacy classes that people are taking, that kids are taking in elementary school. And people are starting, and there are lots of things that people are doing in different places. And I think that we have to start there, but also fundamentally, the bigger thing is not so much media literacy as it is critical thinking. And we're right. That's where the problem comes in, because we should have a kind of chain of reasoning that comes into play around these things. And media, if we teach that topically, sure, I'm all for that. But what we have not done is kind of further the fundamentals of critical thinking. And until we can master that, we're not going to deal with any of the problems of misinformation or disinformation or any of those things. On the side of civil disobedience, I'll just tell you, I don't know the answer to that. I think that there are tools that are applicable to us now in a way that we couldn't have imagined before. It's much easier to organize, it's much easier to network, it's much easier to be in contact with people. Also much easier for those kinds of contacts to be surveilled. And so it's a kind of 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other circumstance. And the thing that I'm confident of, though, is that I think the answers come organically. That we think of it like one of the reasons we talk about the March on Washington and nonviolent direct action is that those things have become institutionalized. But go back and look at how Dr. King was viewed by the NAACP at the time. They thought that what he was doing was wildly irresponsible and radical and all these other kinds of things. Nonviolent direct action, no, you have to do what we do, you have to litigate and you have to lobby and that's the way you get these things done and blah, blah, blah. And they thought that King was just going to upset the apple cart and make it impossible for people to get anything done. And so there may be some other iteration of that. But I think that the problem itself inspires the reaction that eventually produces, at least, if not a solution, then a significant and important response. I think that this situation that we're in will get worse before it gets better. And I think that people will have to grapple with what that looks like. And so, my wife is always asking me, what are your red lines? And I was like, I'm waiting for journalists to start being arrested en masse. And he's like, you think that'll happen? Yes, I think that will happen. I also think that they will try to use the federal troops that are being stationed in cities in order to deter people from voting in 2026. Yeah. And so how do we respond to that? I don't know how we respond to that, but I think that we should be talking about that. We should have those conversations. Those should be the things that we are discussing, and that some solution comes organically out of that. That's the best I can do.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all.
And so now we're going to go on to signing. We will have a line right outside the Wheeler Auditorium for the signing portion. We'll be outside in 5 minutes. We will have a staff member to tab your books. Thank you for coming and have a good night.